So did you guys hear? James might actually be looking at you in the intro to Silent Hill 2.
Whoa.
Hey, I'm Fingers.
Yo, this is Vector.
Hey everyone, this is Days Ahead.
And I'm Nitroid. You're listening to the Kojima Frequency. It's wild, right?
And what does that mean?
Yeah, because I didn't really get the significance of it. I was like, okay. Like I said, I'm not the biggest Silent Hill guy, so I just didn't really understand it. But that's why I brought it to y'all's attention. I
guess from a generic standpoint, it could be sort of like one of those creepy, like, oh, he was looking at you, into your soul. I don't know.
I think it's just a lighting trick.
Well, I think somebody had mentioned maybe one of the developers. I don't know. Maybe Ito. He had said something like, James as a model, his eyes are supposed to track with the camera, and the camera's behind. Yeah, and they didn't expect some dude 20 years later to jack up the brightness on the first scene of a single frame.
Here's a question. Is it valid to interpret a game based on things you've only discovered by manipulating the game?
Yes, absolutely.
You think so?
I mean, look at the hot coffee mod. You know, if you don't manipulate the actual code of the game, you don't even see that that's there. Or the nude character models in the original Oblivion, which is why that game had to be reclassified with an M rating.
But that's not what I mean. I'm not talking about in terms of classifying or rating. I'm talking in terms of interpreting the game's meaning or story or intent.
I don't think there's a difference personally, because it's like you're trying to derive meaning, whether that's you're applying a rating to it to determine what audience this game is suitable for, or any, what did the developers mean when they put those nude character models in there? Why did they do that? Were they trying to create a more realistic world? Were they trying to make it more mature? I mean, it's either way. If you hide something and that has meaning, and then someone discovers it, it's weird, right? Because it's like Takayoshi Sato, he did those CG cutscenes by himself. Ask him.
So I'll give you an example from Metal Gear, actually, and I got into a fairly lengthy argument with a friend of mine about this. When Emma is crossing the oil fence in Metal Gear Solid 2, and Vamp jumps up and grabs her, it has always seemed to me like Snake had a clear shot. Why didn't he take the shot?
Plot armor.
And there's a lot of debate around this. The Snake Soup has done some, a write-up about this, and there's different ways you can interpret it. I went into the document of MGS2, and I panned the camera back behind Snake to see exactly what his shot would look like from his point of view.
Yeah.
And from that point of view, it absolutely looks like he's got a clear shot. Like he could not have a clearer shot. But then that started the argument of, you're manipulating the game. You're manipulating the camera, and you're looking at it in a way that was not intended. So that's not a valid interpretation. You need to go by what was presented to you, not by what you manipulated the game to see. And I understand the logic there.
It's interesting because it's almost like Death of the Author with extra steps, because there's that technical element now, right?
Right.
Wait a second. For people that ain't got no learning, I need you to explain what Death of the Author is.
So, I'm going to be real with you. I'm pretty sure Nitroid can explain this better than I can.
Oh, God.
But I'm going to shoot my shot and give it a whirl. So, from my understanding, Death of the Author is essentially when an author pushes out a piece of media and it's released in its final form. Essentially, their agency over how the media is interpreted is officially dead, in a sense that how the audience interprets the media or the work is now under their control. Like the author can't disrupt that meaning. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense.
Oh, like what J.K. Rowling does constantly.
Yeah, in fact, I've seen a lot of like YouTube videos about the concept of death of the author used to almost justify continuing to support Harry Potter despite J.K. Rowling's opinions.
So yeah, you essentially hit the nail on the head. The Death of the Author was an essay written in the 60s by a French critic. And the argument was essentially that once a piece of work is out in the wild, it no longer belongs to the author and they don't have authority over it. And it then becomes the property of the audience to an extent, and they are free to interpret it, and those interpretations are just as valid as anything the author might have offered. So yeah, you essentially got it. And it's an argument, not an absolute. You can interpret works via death of the author, or you can assume author authority. There's nothing to say that one way is more valid than another, right? It's just how do you choose to interpret this? It ultimately doesn't mean all that much, in my opinion. It's funny to apply death of the author to Metal Gear, given how most of the conversations you find in the fandom tend to focus on what Kojima intended, right? Like, most arguments I'll see about the games are, well, Kojima either intended this or didn't intend that, or his vision was compromised by this, that, and the other thing. And so Death of the Author is not something that I see very often pop up in Metal Gear discussions. And maybe that's just because it's kind of a higher concept that doesn't really work its way into video game conversation too often. So
it seems like people just ignore whatever they say anyway. It's like we can be like, the devs said this, and they're like, it doesn't matter.
Right. Yeah. It's most of the time,
especially with Metal Gear.
Right. Most of the time, if somebody can point to like, well, Kojima said this in an interview here, then that kind of shuts it down.
Then you can point to another interview that says the opposite. It's just like, all right, what are we doing here?
Right. So like, it's funny because I've said this before, but contradictions and retcons in the Metal Gear franchise are not a bug; they're a feature.
Yep.
You know, that drives so much debate and conversation and interest in these games, because Kojima will write a story and then immediately write another story that contradicts the previous story. And there is no doubt that he is aware that he's doing this.
Right.
So he's acknowledged this openly before, where he'll say like, well, yeah, in order to tell the story I wanted to tell, I had to fudge some details. And then there's the issue of like, is portable ops canon? Which there's a rabbit hole for you.
I don't think it's really a rabbit hole. Portable ops is canon, and there are fans that they choose to say it's not canon because they're mad that Kojima didn't direct it. And so there's like the hardcore Kojima zealots. They say that only the games that he directed personally are Metal Gear canon. But Kojima said himself that Portable Ops was canon, and there are some small things that deviate, but it wasn't like they completely contradicted anything. He just said they deviate slightly. But he's gone on record.
Yeah.
No, but then after that...
Yeah, and like he probably would have done some things differently.
No, because after that, he later recanted and said, well, unless it's a Hideo Kojima game, if it's not something I wrote and directed, it's not a part of the Metal Gear saga.
He has
wafted back and forth on this.
This is the point that we made like 2 minutes ago, isn't it? Like, we can go back and forth with his words, but at the end of the day, you know...
Well, that's my point. That's why it's a rabbit hole, because he contradicts his own answers to this question.
Post that. I want that posted in the description of this podcast. Like, where did he say
Source
that?
your shit right
now.
Yeah,
it was during an interview.
Find the interview. I want to see it in my face.
I think it was actually Jose Molinas who asked him this question during an interview with Jeff Keighley.
Yeah, that's the interview that I'm referencing, where he straight up said it's canon.
Then it's another interview. And to that point, I want to just make it clear, he has never used the word canon in any answer he has ever given. That is not in his vocabulary.
Well, then we have to use semantics and other linguistic tools to interpret what the hell he means.
Right, and that's the problem.
Okay, I get what you're saying.
This is how I picture Major Tom and Big Boss arguing about the boss's will. Well, in this transcript, she said that borders should just be arbitrary. Well, in this interview, she said, "No,
Right.
sorry, that sounds."
So are you saying that? So are you saying that the Metal Gear Saga is essentially the death of the boss?
Yeah. Once she put her will out there, the audience could do whatever they wanted with it, for better or worse. But you know, I had like two responses, I guess, to that point about, you know, Metal Gear fans just totally disregarding the death of the author. You know, one thing is I kind of think that's inherent to the fandom in a sense that. And I feel like you guys are going to be like, you are overrating this fandom so much right now, Chelsea. But I feel like one aspect of Metal Gear's narrative is sort of thinking critically about the plot, whether it's, you know, interpreting everybody's motives in Metal Gear Solid 1 with Naomi and Fox Die and the Colonel and Liquid, or critically thinking about how the plot sort of unfolded in Metal Gear Solid 2 and Raiden having to, you know, rethink the motives of his superiors. So what I'm trying to get at is it's always been about questioning the intent of others. So in some ways, you know, Metal Gear is inherent to constantly questioning the intent of its